Do you see this image as going from the left to the right, or do you see it as going from the right to the left? So if you look at this image as going from left to right, you are taking the teleological worldview. To take the teleological view of a historical event, or of the evolution of an organism, or the evolution of rock and roll music in America, whatever, is to say, okay, knowing where it starts, I can predict where it's going to end. This worldview says, if I start off with that ape, and I know enough about that ape, its biology, its environment, its priorities, its wants and desires, the wants and desires of the other organisms that are in its environment and what's happening to them, you have all that information stacked up, you could predict that this would be the natural outcome. The teleological worldview is not right or wrong, it's just a thought experiment. But it can be really hard to use in the real world, because think of all the information you need in order to correctly predict that if I start off with that ape and wait a couple million years, I'll end up with that human. In his phenomenal 2016 book, The Big Picture, the physicist Sean Carroll invents this word, ekinological, and he means it as something that's like the opposite of teleological. To take the ekinological worldview is to start off with wherever the story is right now and walk backwards in time and try to figure out how we got there. So a teleological telling of human evolution might go, we started off with this ape, but then it was more caloric cost effective to stand upright. So the apes that could only walk on all fours started getting outcompeted by the ones that could balance on two legs, and then be able to stand fully upright was more helpful in going across the Serengeti or whatever, until we end up at this human. But the ekinological worldview says, well, right now we have humans. And you say, why? Well, evolution had, before that, kind of like this standing caveman thing to work with, and it turned that into a human with minor tweaks. Well, why did that happen? Well, before that, all it had to work with was this hominoid bipedal ape. Then it made a couple tweaks, and why did that happen? And so on and so forth. A teleological telling of the history of rock and roll might start off with, well, first we had the blues, and then thing happened, and we ended up with punk. But an ekinological telling would say, right now we have punk rock. Why? Because the people who created punk rock, they were kind of tired of the excess and showiness of 70s and 80s glam rock. Well, why? Well, because it had become kind of an industry, rock and roll. Before that, it was still a little bit rebellious and difficult to get on the radio, and they turned it more into a theatrical for performance in order to, okay, so why was that? Well, before that, there was this thing called the blues, which was primarily a black music that was, white people were a little unsure about whether or not they could just listen to it directly, so it needed to be filtered through like some rockabilly and so on. It's not like one is better than the other. Ekinological thinking, teleological thinking, both perfectly valid, both perfectly fine. It's just that if you learn to think ekinologically as well as teleologically, if you learn to play the ekinological game and do those thought experiments, it'll bring you to conclusions and realizations and interesting insights that you can't come to if you only think teleologically. Teleological thinking kind of gets people in these traps where they say, well, if I started with that, I have to end with this. It was inevitable. There's nothing that could have been done about it. The ekinological worldview makes it more obvious that if circumstances had been different, or if circumstances had been the same, but people had just made different choices in those circumstances, you could have ended up at a whole different set of realities. The teleological worldview kind of looks at everything that happens and asks, what is its effect? The ekinological worldview kind of looks at everything that happens and says, okay, what is its cause? It's just two different tools for examining the same phenomenon, but you'll come to different conclusions and realizations if you try out both.